Hello, BookTube. Well, we come to it at last, the final episode of the Western Canon Starter Kit that I started months and months ago. Uh, those of you who might be new to the whole thing, this has been a series in which I have tried to stress that diving in to some of the most influential works in the Western canon is not as intimidating as it sometimes seems. You don't need professional instruction, you don't need school, and you don't need 10 years of your life either. This list, these books, this starter kit, is not, of course, comprehensive at all. There are so many more canonical works to talk about. And I've had to be ruthless, especially as we come closer to the present day, because the closer we get to the present day, the more we're dealing with a proliferation of literature, and therefore a proliferation of canons. I've had to pare away a lot, and that's been painful. And I had to do that too, because now we end at the beginning of the 20th century. And the 20th century was a bewildering, confusing, super abundant literary period. So paring things down to a small list here to finish out our Western Canon starter kit was extra hard. I have a list of just a handful of books that cast long shadows, are very, very influential, and that are also come up a lot, are referenced a lot. So one of my goals in this Western Canon starter kit has been to give you an encouragement to read books that you are going to encounter in references, in echoes, in allusions, that sort of thing. Which is why I've left out a lot of writers who I really like. I've left out the Fairy Queen. I've left out John Dryden. I've left out all sorts of people that were big and influential in their time, but that don't cast long shadows today. And of course, the tricky thing about that for the 20th century is that the closer you get to your own time, the more those assertions are really guesses. Well informed, maybe. In my case, I've done a lot of reading, and I've been reading for a long time. But nevertheless, if you were to have asked somebody in my position 100 years ago to name 6 or 5 canonical works that will certainly be around in 100 years, they would certainly have named a couple of books that aren't here anymore, a couple of authors that no one reads anymore. That just happens. It happens less the more time goes on, but even so, I'm fairly certain of the books that I have picked. And the first one is Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, which is strange and beautiful and trying at times. It's not an easy book, unlike, for instance, the second book on the list, which is The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. These are books you have to read. You have to know them. But The Great Gatsby is, in my opinion, far more venerated than it deserves, but still incredibly influential. Everyone who's written a book has read it. And it's also entered into the literary, referential, and cultural folklore. And it's a very good read. I don't mean to dismiss it at all. The same thing is true with the next author, who I don't value anywhere near as highly as his partisans do, and that's Ernest Hemingway. And the thing from him that you need to read is any 10 short stories. Just, if you like them, by all means, read the big collected stories of Ernest Hemingway. But if you don't, if you find them a little grating on the one good nerve, as I do, any 5 of them will do just fine. In fact, when you look at the table of contents for a big collection of the short stories of Ernest Hemingway, you'll see right away the 5 that you should read. There are 5 or 6 that have come into popular parlance, and they're the ones that you should read. It won't be by any means, anesthesia-free dentistry. He's a capable, smooth writer, and then you'll know him. You'll be able to have a grounding for Hemingway, to either go on to the novels or to say, okay, I get it. I get what you're doing. And then the next book on the list is, in my opinion, one of the greatest works of the 20th century. Still immensely readable for all that. I don't mean it to be intimidating. And that's The House of Mirth by Edith Wharton, which, you shouldn't be without Edith Wharton. I myself am a huge fan of virtually her entire body of work, but The House of Mirth is a masterpiece. So that would be the next book on the list. And then the one after that is very short, almost a novella, uh, and it's Death in Venice by Thomas Mann. And it's on here because I think it's incredibly influential, especially influential in the vast array of gay literature that followed in its wake. But also, it gives you a taste of Mann without signing you up for Magic Mountain, which is one of the greatest novels ever written, but which is an undertaking. And we don't want that. One of the key things about the Western Canon Starter Kit has been to, as much as I could, decrease the intimidation factor. There's a lot of readers out there, very, very smart, very nimble-brained readers out there who look at these big, dusty classics and think, well, okay, I'm not ready for that yet. I'm not ready to sink in the time. I'm not ready to sink in the concentration. And I worry that a lot of great books go unread for that reason. And the Magic Mountain, I think, is a perfect example of a great book that goes on. War and Peace would be another example. Great books that go unread by readers who would love them because of what amounts to bad PR. And I understand that because it's a big, involved undertaking. But you have to know Thomas Mann, and Death in Venice is short and will give you a very good idea of the brilliance of this author. And those are the major canonical works that we're going to wrap up with. There's one that I want to add. Since all along in the Western Canon Starter Kit, I've been talking about books, in addition to their intrinsic literary value, I've been talking about the shadow they cast and the effect they've had on reading culture. And the last book I want to recommend has cast an enormous shadow and has warped and changed and influenced the reading culture almost more than any other English language book I can think of, except in rarefied channels, in comparatively narrow channels. And that's The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien, which you really have to read. It's huge. Yes, it's a gigantic book. But it's a lot more inviting when it gets going than, for instance, something like Buddenbrooks or The House of Mirth. And an entire world, an entire genre, an entire 2 generations of readers sprang from that book. From not only the ideas in it, which have been ripped off left, right, and center, but also the mind frame in it. It's rare as readers that you get to look at a single work and say, okay, an entire genre more or less started right there. I mean, you look at, for instance, quote unquote hard science fiction, and you think, well, there's Jules Verne, but there's also H.G. Wells and Gernsback and a couple of other people. There's no clear, demarcated starting point. And you could do the same thing for Tolkien. You could say there's Lord Dunsany, for instance. But it pretty much started a genre. The Lord of the Rings did. So I'm going to add that, even though it usually wouldn't be on anybody's canonical list. But the first 4, Mrs. Dalloway, and by extension anything by Virginia Woolf, the Great Gatsby, and by extension The Beautiful and the Damned, which is more demanding as a book, but I think much better. And then the short stories of Ernest Hemingway, and by extension the novels of Ernest Hemingway, if you've got a stomach for it. Certainly they've been enormously influential. And they're also easy to read. Death in Venice, and by way of that, an invitation to the rest of Thomas Mann, who you really shouldn't miss him. Oh, all right, well, Joseph and His Brothers, you might give a miss to. But The Magic Mountain, you should read before you die. And Lord of the Rings, as kind of an invitation to a genre. But that's the way of the Western canon just from start to finish. It's come up over and over again in these videos, is that these books, in addition to demystifying the process for you, in addition to giving you a short, manageable list, something that, despite the fact that it took me 10 years to get the videos out, the actual reading of these books wouldn't take you even a year. And it wouldn't have to be your only reading in that year. This is not, in other words, a gigantic commitment. And it yields gigantically in the time. But in the course of doing that, of recommending these works, I've also repeatedly said that they are all invitations to a wider world. That's what the Western canon is. And that's what this series is meant to be. It's meant to be sort of a foot in the door to read these things because they're essential, and then move on to other things that are almost equally essential, and then it always happens. I've been delighted to see it happen in 2 generations of students now. After a little while, you'll start to feel out where in the Western canon you really want to be at home. And then you'll make yourself at home. You'll find everything there is in a certain type of writing or school of writing or a certain author, and branch out from there. That was the whole point of this series, is that this is a living, personal, non-intimidating process that you can jump right into. So that is going to wrap it up. Of course, in the course of making these videos, I've had 80 million suggestions to amplify a Western Canon starter kit, maybe to do Western Canon sophomore year. And those are all great ideas, and I think I should do that. I'd certainly love to do it. There's nothing really, I mean, I talk about giant killer sharks and High School Musical and Regency romances, and of course you know from my mail hauls that I can get girlishly excited about almost anything if it looks good. But when we come right down to it, if you remember what the background in my other room looks like, the wall of Penguin classics, when you come right down to it, these canonical works, the great works of literature, are my bread and butter. They're the thing I'm most comfortable with and happiest to proselytize about. So well, I think future series are definitely going to happen. But in the meantime, that wraps up the Western Canon starter kit. So there you go. I didn't think I was going to reach this point, but there we have it. I could easily do more videos on the 20th century. Of course, I have a huge number of books to talk about, but we'll stop there. And that'll wrap things up. So we'll go on to other things from here. And thank you all for your patience. I realize this took a long time for me to do, but I think it was worth it in the end. I was very happy to talk about these things with you all. And I'll see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.